Marco Rubio recently transformed Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez into the most vulnerable figure within Congress. I have observed numerous congressional hearings that fade from memory before I even reach my car, but this particular exchange has occupied my thoughts ever since. Marco Rubio directed 8 specific words at Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez during a committee session, prompting her to activate her microphone without managing a single word in reply. To comprehend the significance of this silence, you must first listen to her initial remarks. Inside Rayburn Room 2359 during a State Department budget appropriations hearing, Rubio sat at the witness table with merely a folder and a glass of water, while Ocasio-Cortez sat opposite him equipped with a color-coded binder and her smartphone resting face up. The chairman yielded the floor to her, and she seized the moment in her typical fashion with rapid, booming, and absolute certainty. She immediately attacked Rubio regarding reductions in foreign aid, asserting that he had decimated initiatives designed to safeguard women and children internationally. She proclaimed that the State Department under his guidance had transformed into what she coined a vanity project fueled by Cold War nostalgia, before twisting the knife even further. The secretary, she argued, appeared more focused on resolving ancestral vendettas with Cuba than advancing American priorities overseas, adding that those who praise his leadership derive their entire foreign policy understanding from evening cable television broadcasts. That is not genuine expertise but mere entertainment, and right there emerged that familiar condescending tone you have undoubtedly recognized before. Having watched her operate for 6 years, I know she dissects the room before the gavel even falls, determining who possesses intellect and who lacks it while ensuring everyone knows precisely where they stand. She delivers this judgment with a subtle smile, acting as though she is granting you a massive favor through her brutal honesty. I need you to understand that she was talking about you while staring directly into a nationally broadcast camera, essentially telling hardworking citizens watching the evening news that they are simply too unintelligent to grasp international relations. She directed this insult at individuals who have actively engaged with their nation's politics for 4 decades, saying it intentionally with that exact smirk, and she meant every single syllable. If that strikes a nerve with you the way it resonated with me, please subscribe to this channel immediately, because Rubio's subsequent reaction is the entire reason I am sharing this narrative, and you will absolutely want to witness its conclusion. However, before revealing Rubio's response, I must introduce you to an 82-year-old woman named Gloria, a Queens resident who retired from the Postal Service after 31 years of diligently sorting mail. A couple of years ago, her granddaughter presented her with a video and confidently declared that this politician was fiercely battling for people exactly like them. Gloria contributed $18 from her limited Social Security funds to Ocasio-Cortez's campaign, a highly deliberate figure calculated only after accounting for rent, groceries, and essential utility bills. Keep that precise dollar amount in your mind, because we will certainly return to its significance shortly. Rubio offered absolutely no reaction to her abrasive insult, which is precisely his signature style that veteran observers always anticipate, as he steadfastly refuses to take the bait. He remained seated with folded hands, patiently waiting for her to conclude before allowing the silence to linger uncomfortably long, finally breaking it by expressing his gratitude. He stated that he genuinely appreciated the Congresswoman's intense passion regarding taxpayer expenditures, noting that we should all deeply care about where those funds travel and whether they actually reach vulnerable populations. At that exact moment, anyone aware of the contents within his singular folder would have recognized the trap's jaws beginning to snap decisively shut. He was by no means changing the underlying subject, rather, he was masterfully constructing the very floorboards he intended to yank directly out from beneath her feet. He calmly addressed her by noting her House service since January 2019, pointing out that over those 7 years, he wondered exactly how many of her sponsored bills had been codified into law.
She proceeded to speak continuously for roughly 90 seconds, eagerly discussing legislative advocacy, floor amendments, coalition building, committee efforts, and shifting the broader national dialogue. She touched upon every conceivable tangent with polished eloquence and practiced rhythm, effectively answering every single unasked question while completely dodging his specific inquiry. Rubio politely allowed her to finish her elaborate monologue before supplying the single numerical word she desperately avoided giving him, which was 0. Rubio highlighted that despite 7 years in office and 13 million loyal social media followers, she had not produced a single piece of legislation bearing her name that received a presidential signature. I jotted that astonishing ratio onto a napkin following the hearing and have stared at it continuously, realizing that 13 million to 0 represents a taxpayer-funded social media influencer rather than a serious legislative record. He then executed a calculated maneuver that experienced political spectators immediately recognized, intentionally ignoring the folder at first to take a strategic detour toward the Munich Security Conference. He reminded her of her February attendance at the Munich Security Conference, Europe's premier foreign policy summit, where she publicly proclaimed on camera before global allies and adversaries that Venezuela sat below the equator. He paused for dramatic effect, gently informing the Congresswoman that every single square mile of Venezuela is undeniably located within the Northern Hemisphere. He mentioned dedicating 30 years to Western Hemisphere affairs and having family who fled that region, marveling that the woman seeking to dictate American foreign policy lacked the geographical competence to locate Venezuela on a basic globe. I must concede that she managed to physically hold her composure, yet the atmosphere in the room shifted so palpably that it felt exactly like the deck of a tilting ship. The devastating reality of botching basic geography on a global platform is that it transcends a minor verbal slip, fully exposing the severe lack of preparation behind the theatrical performance. Both international allies and hostile adversaries populated that Munich conference hall, and the ambitious politician aiming to steer American diplomacy essentially confessed to them all her ignorance regarding Venezuela's proper hemisphere. That profound error functions less as a simple gaffe and more as a definitive resume, prompting Rubio to pivot by questioning how someone dictating Latin American funding handles her own personal financial oversight. He finally opened the folder announcing that he possessed her official 2025 Federal Election Commission filings, which contained campaign disbursement records legally filed under her name and authorized by her treasurer. It became instantly clear she was oblivious to the folder's existence when her right hand instinctively reached for a binder tab before freezing in a revealing, motionless pause. She had meticulously organized 22 separate tabs for 22 anticipated counterattacks, yet absolutely none of them equipped her for this specific confrontation. Before he began reciting the figures, I need you to fully grasp a detail the cameras missed, which is that every hotel name and precise dollar amount originated directly from her personal financial filings. She personally authorized these documents before her treasurer submitted them to the federal government, instantly cementing them as easily accessible public records available for universal scrutiny. Rubio did not unearth any hidden scandals that she had not voluntarily submitted herself, making the subsequent 10 minutes an unforgettable spectacle etched into my memory. She had effectively constructed her own inescapable trap without realizing it, and the contents of that folder will permanently alter your perspective on every political donation you ever make. If you know anyone who has ever sacrificed $18 or $25 for a politician they trusted, please share this narrative with them immediately before returning for the moment the receipts begin to speak. Rubio hoisted the first sheet of paper with the casual indifference of lifting a grocery store receipt off a kitchen counter, stripping away all theatrical drama to present raw facts. He read aloud a $3,200 charge for a single stay at the Langham Huntington in Pasadena, explicitly noting it occurred the identical week she lectured a rally about working-class families struggling to buy groceries. Glancing up from the document, he sharply observed that an average family residing within her Bronx and Queens district requires 4 full months to spend that equivalent amount on basic sustenance. He contrasted 4 grueling months of feeding an entire family against a single luxurious night she enjoyed inside her opulent hotel suite. Placing that page flatly against the desk, he produced a second receipt for $2,900 at the Vidara Hotel and Spa in Las Vegas, ironically tied to her attendance at an anti-oligarchy rally with Senator Sanders. He aligned the pages perfectly edge to edge while mocking her supposed battle against the wealthy oligarchy, aggressively pointing out that she waged this righteous war from the lavish confines of a luxury spa. Every single spectator occupying the gallery began mentally calculating those extravagant expenses, a collective realization clearly evidenced by their sudden synchronized forward lean. A woman seated in the third row instinctively covered her mouth in shock, while a man near the center aisle initiated a slow, unbroken rhythm of disappointed head-shaking. The vital detail missing from the television cameras was that he was never reading those numbers merely to humiliate her, but rather reciting them directly for the retirees, veterans, and struggling mothers who sacrificed their hard-earned dollars for a righteous cause. He read those campaign receipts exactly as one would present a fraudulent invoice to an unaware victim, successfully replicating the gut-wrenching feeling of discovering massive unauthorized charges inside a freshly opened envelope. This is precisely the juncture where she valiantly fought back, and I must remain fair in acknowledging that she absolutely refused to go down quietly, which was the correct political instinct. She aggressively defended herself by stating that every congressional representative incurs travel expenses, utilizing her famously sharp, rapid, and furious attack voice that undeniably makes her a formidable opponent. She forcefully leaned into the microphone to declare that he was framing standard Federal Election Commission filings as criminal evidence, insisting these expenditures were simply the normalized operational costs of modern campaigns. She challenged the secretary to redirect the spending conversation toward his alleged destruction of overseas child nutrition programs, demanding they focus on the abandoned women and girls impacted by his incredibly destructive budget proposals. She was engaging in genuine political warfare at this point, and surprisingly enough, her fierce counterattack actually connected deeply enough to visibly shift the room's atmosphere. A pair of journalists in the press gallery frantically accelerated their note-taking, and a staff aide positioned behind her straightened their posture as the pure momentum swung entirely into her favor for a fleeting 15 seconds. She temporarily commanded the room and the microphone with that incredibly resonant voice she summons when speaking with true conviction, and despite what critics claim, she genuinely believed her own impassioned defense. Rubio completely ignored the emotional pivot toward foreign aid and brilliantly refused the bait, showcasing the exact discipline trait that makes him incredibly dangerous during these public hearings. He effortlessly absorbed the rhetorical blow, allowed the audience to process the drama, and then immediately returned to his cold evidence as if her fiery speech had never occurred. He calmly clarified that he was not disputing her fundamental right to travel, but rather heavily questioning the dishonest narrative she feeds the impoverished families who finance it, simultaneously lifting his next piece of evidence. He unveiled a $3,445 receipt from the Asher Adams Hotel in Salt Lake City, coldly noting that a single night in Utah equated to roughly 2 entire months of median rent back in her district. He methodically placed this document beside the prior ones, creating a damning row of 4 consecutive receipts resembling a disastrous poker hand that someone foolishly forgot to fold. The subsequent bill featured a staggering $9,440 charge at a Puerto Rican resort, occurring the exact same year she humiliated herself geographically in Munich. He ruthlessly quipped that while she clearly could not locate the nation on a basic map, she effortlessly located the luxury resort, a staggering sum that instantly forced my thoughts back to Gloria's situation. Gloria survives on roughly $1,800 a month from Social Security, meaning that single Puerto Rican hotel bill effectively consumed more than 5 uninterrupted months of Gloria's total earthly income. Yet Gloria still mailed $18 to that exact campaign, simply because her granddaughter promised that a heroic politician was fighting fiercely for their economic survival. Rubio was far from finished as he set the page down to look her squarely in the eyes, stating that 62% of her donors contribute under $50, representing retirees, veterans, and mothers who meticulously count every penny before donating. They mailed off their small increments of cash because they honestly believed you were engaged in a righteous battle for their survival. Yet this row of receipts reveals exactly where their sacrificial money actually slumbered. This is precisely the critical juncture where the narrative transcends a single congresswoman and morphs into a cautionary tale for anyone who has ever trusted a Washington politician with their painstakingly earned wages. A $25 donation sounds trivial until you realize it originated from a struggling citizen who carefully evaluated their utility bills, grocery lists, and medical prescriptions before deciding they could barely spare it for a trusted leader. Anyone who has ever made that financial sacrifice instantly understood the gravity of the room's atmosphere, which prompted her to play her ultimate trump card by dropping her voice into a deeply personal, quiet register. She passionately identified herself as a working-class woman from the Bronx who previously bartended, nervously counting her meager tips after long shifts while agonizing over her impending rent payments. She firmly declared her intimate familiarity with the anxiety of checking a depleted bank balance before purchasing groceries, aggressively ordering the secretary not to sit upon his elite perch and lecture her about working-class struggles. She accused him of knowing absolutely nothing about her arduous life journey, and honestly, her historical narrative regarding bartending, counting tips, and fearing eviction was entirely grounded in factual truth. That foundational chapter of her personal history was incredibly authentic, and the undeniable sincerity ringing within her voice proved she meant every deeply emotional word. The devastating question Rubio was perfectly positioned to answer was whether that humble origin story remained currently accurate, or if it had merely degraded into a theatrical costume she wore whenever she needed public sympathy. He revealed that his own mother labored as a hotel maid, delivering the statement with a firm quietness rather than softness, compelling the entire fascinated room to lean closer. He described how his mother meticulously cleaned luxurious accommodations, exactly like the ones listed across her scandalous federal financial disclosures, specifically citing the Langham, the Vidara, and the Asher Adams. She made those lavish beds and scrubbed those pristine bathrooms, returning home every single night of his youth reeking heavily of industrial bleach, yet she never uttered a single complaint because she prioritized building a brighter future for her children. He paused intentionally for 2 agonizing seconds before dropping the devastating revelation that his mother never once experienced the luxury of actually sleeping inside one of those magnificent rooms. He directly contrasted her brief stint as a bartender before winning a lucrative political election against his mother's grueling multi-decade career scrubbing elite hotel accommodations. He recalled that the most lavish lodging his mother ever enjoyed was an Orlando Holiday Inn for a family birthday, where she stepped inside and genuinely declared it the most beautiful space she had ever witnessed. Looking up with absolute authority, he assured the Congresswoman that he knew precisely what the authentic working class looked like, and it certainly did not resemble a $3,400 invoice hidden beneath campaign travel expenses. The room plunged into such a profound, unnecessary silence that the ambient hum of the air conditioning and the subtle weight shifts of nearby cameramen became intensely audible. Rubio's maneuver was far beyond a standard debate tactic, easily transcending the usual realm of clever political comebacks, rehearsed zingers, or superficial gotcha moments. It was a profound display of a man standing squarely between 2 wildly divergent versions of the American working-class narrative and forcing the public to decide which one remained authentic. The stark comparison featured 2 individuals claiming humble roots, yet one family retained the metaphorical scent of bleach on their hands, while the other shamelessly wielded $3,000 luxury hotel invoices. Anyone raised within a household where exhausted parents returned from obscure, unglamorous labor instantly recognized which narrative held genuine, unshakable truth. You hardly needed Senator Rubio to explain this incredibly obvious reality to you, considering you have inherently understood this dynamic for your entire existence. His mother dedicated her entire working life to making beds inside rooms that cost more nightly than her weekly salary, endlessly scrubbing pristine bathrooms she could never use and folding luxury towels she would never enjoy. Meanwhile, the heavily branded champion of the modern working class casually slept inside those exact same opulent rooms using funds harvested from struggling donors. If you genuinely recognize the distinct odor of industrial bleach after a grueling shift, please share this video with just one peer before returning to witness the specific moment that completely broke her spirit. An utterly unexpected development then unfolded when a moderate Democratic colleague on the subcommittee, who had reluctantly aligned his voting record with hers for years, slowly leaned toward his microphone. He had remained perfectly silent throughout the entire grueling hearing with tightly folded hands, eventually speaking in a cautiously measured tone belonging to a man who had agonized over this exact intervention for years. He prefaced his remarks by acknowledging his vast disagreements with the secretary, yet noted that he always advises his skeptical constituents to judge Congress strictly by its tangible legislative actions rather than its hollow social media posts. He paused to admit that while the Congresswoman's social media presence was undeniably spectacular, his desperate search for her actual legislative accomplishments remained devastatingly unfulfilled. Receiving such a brutal critique from her own political flank visibly impacted her differently, as she had grown entirely accustomed to easily deflecting standard partisan attacks since her inaugural week in Washington. However, enduring a calm condemnation from a friendly colleague who gained nothing politically by spontaneously incinerating their professional bridge proved to be an entirely more catastrophic experience. This was no longer routine political theater, but rather a professional peer stating plainly on national television that her elaborate performance completely lacked any substantive underlying labor. I have witnessed that exact facial expression before, and it always precedes the terrifying realization that an intimidating aura has permanently evaporated from a previously fearful room. Once an audience collectively sheds its fear of a political figure, absolutely no amount of viral tweets or live Instagram broadcasts can ever restore that broken illusion of power. I must grant her immense credit for launching one final desperate counteroffensive right up until the bitter end, flatly refusing to quietly surrender the narrative. She mockingly invited them to count past bills while fiercely defending her impact, arguing that her Green New Deal permanently altered the climate dialogue and her infamous gala dress commanded 30 million views. She passionately declared that while others obsess over signed laws, she successfully shifted the entire cultural baseline regarding healthcare and inequality, defining her massive rhetorical influence as the truest form of modern leadership. I must admit she raised a valid point, and while I aggressively oppose her politics and would never offer her my vote, denying the immense cultural impact of her carefully curated brand would be highly intellectually dishonest. Several individuals within the chamber physically nodded in agreement, completely missing that the core issue was never her ability to generate conversation, but rather the exorbitant price tag of that dialogue and exactly who financed it. This sweeping rhetorical tactic is her standard defense mechanism whenever factual evidence corners her. She automatically inflates the scope to encompass grand historical movements and vague cultural moments. The fatal flaw in hiding behind the broad arc of history is that abstract historical movements do not sign federal financial disclosures, whereas she most certainly does. Intangible political movements never physically check into the Langham-Huntington, but she absolutely did, aggressively betraying working-class citizens like Gloria, who sacrificed their precious security checks for a trustworthy leader rather than a mere conversation. Rubio brutally dismantled her defense by noting that while she merely shifted abstract conversations and debates, he successfully signed binding international treaties and fundamentally altered government operations. He allowed that devastating comparison to marinate before weaponizing her own examples, pointing out that she wore a viral dress while $53,000 of donor cash slept soundly inside luxury suites. Leaning aggressively forward, he sharply reminded the Congresswoman that endless political conversations never put food on a struggling family's table, but robust laws and binding treaties absolutely do. He emphasized that an elderly woman in Queens did not bravely carve $18 out of her fixed income just so a politician could theoretically shift a cultural debate. That vulnerable voter donated because she desperately needed a fierce advocate, yet her tiny financial sacrifice was instead funneled into covering exorbitant bills at the Langham-Huntington in California. He completely avoided raising his voice because the raw truth possessed an inherent deafening volume that the entire room instantly recognized. The shifting balance of power did not occur with a sudden chaotic crash, but rather mimicked the agonizingly slow, steady tilt of a severed tree trunk, contemplating its final descent. Everyone spectating within that gallery fully grasped the inevitable trajectory of the confrontation, leaving the politician clutching the microphone as the sole individual oblivious to her impending collapse. My extensive tenure in Washington allows me to perfectly distinguish between a fleeting political spat and a foundational earthquake that permanently alters the underlying architecture of a room. This specific atmospheric shift is deeply palpable, evidenced primarily by the way distracted observers abruptly abandon their glowing smartphones and collectively hold their nervous breath. The ensuing spectacle definitely belonged to the latter category, as Rubio meticulously squared the edges of his federal receipts exactly like a seasoned card player preparing to deal a final ruinous hand. The already hushed chamber descended into an even more suffocating level of silence, creating the intensely terrifying environment where your own rapid heartbeat becomes deafeningly loud. He finally unleashed those 8 catastrophic words, and I am going to reveal exactly what they were before describing the absolute paralysis that immediately gripped the surrounding room. You will soon comprehend why I meticulously crafted this entire narrative, because throughout 30 years I have heard countless clever zingers that dominated the evening news cycle only to vanish by Sunday. This devastating sentence transcended those fleeting sound bites entirely, beginning with him reminding the Congresswoman that she had spent 7 lucrative years insisting she was bravely fighting the wealthy oligarchy. Tapping the neat stack of receipts with a single finger, he recited her $53,000 in luxury hotel stays, first-class airline tickets, an elite Bad Bunny concert suite, and obscenely expensive tasting menus. Following 3 agonizing seconds of absolute silence, he stared directly at her and declared that she never actually fought the oligarchy, but merely expensed her luxurious lifestyle to it. Ocasio-Cortez instinctively reached for her microphone console, producing a tiny, desperately sharp clicking noise that violently echoed through the speakers and commanded the entire room's undivided attention. As the audio feed went live, every television camera quickly zoomed in, prompting both the gallery audience and myself to instantly lean forward in overwhelming anticipation. The collective anticipation was immense because she miraculously always conjured a witty retort, relying heavily upon the exact rhetorical gift that had propelled her from a gritty Bronx bar to the United States Congress. She famously possessed an endless reservoir of words whenever her opponents ran dry, yet as 3 and then 5 agonizing seconds passed, she merely opened and closed her mouth in utter defeat. While her trembling fingers remained pressed against the button, her usually reliable voice vanished, leaving her visibly grasping for language like a hand desperately clutching empty air upon a barren shelf. She eventually released the physical button, killing the live feed with a final click that perfectly bookended 5 seconds of completely humiliating, nationally broadcast silence. Throughout 30 years of attending hundreds of hearings and observing thousands of interrogations, that specific span of silence remains the absolute loudest quiet I have ever personally endured. The chairman awkwardly cleared his throat to ask if the gentlewoman from New York wished to issue a rebuttal, prompting her to shake her head once as her fingers aimlessly grazed a brightly colored binder tab meant for her next prepared assault. She completely abandoned the planned maneuver, opting instead to slowly shut the massive binder and lay both defeated hands flatly across its cover to signal her absolute surrender. Despite harboring 22 heavily researched tabs, none contained an adequate defense against those 8 devastating words, leaving me to marvel at the catastrophic collision between a 7-year political performer and a 30-year legislative veteran. The carefully manufactured theatrical performance simply ran out of superficial material while the decades of actual labor stood firm, culminating in a silent 5-second broadcast that perfectly encapsulated a brand shattering on live television. This is the tragic result when a 7-year political persona fatally collides with its own undeniable receipts, and if those 8 words deeply resonated with you, please enable your notifications immediately because the fallout stretched far beyond that committee room. By the early afternoon, some enterprising editor had cleanly sliced those 40 seconds of brutal confrontation, ensuring the clip of those 8 words dominated virtually every television screen across the entire country. Various online commentators quickly spliced the silent humiliation directly beside her aggressive anti-oligarchy rally footage, while others juxtaposed it violently against the $3,000 Asher Adams hotel receipt. A veteran campaign strategist I personally know messaged a worried colleague with a brilliant 2-sentence analysis, simply stating that Rubio had permanently stripped her of the ability to ever utter the word oligarchy again. While I cannot guarantee that incredibly damning prediction will hold true forever, I can absolutely confirm that I have not heard her proudly utilize that specific battle cry since the incident. Later that exact evening in Queens, Gloria sat quietly at her worn kitchen table, meticulously calculating her meager Social Security check using a basic pencil and notepad just as she had always done. Her granddaughter had thankfully configured a tablet for her before departing for an evening shift, allowing Gloria to watch the devastating viral clip exactly once without sharing, commenting, or calling a single soul. She simply remained seated with her hands neatly folded in her customary manner, perfectly mirroring how strong women of her resilient generation physically process profoundly disappointing truths. She silently pondered that massive Salt Lake City expenditure, painfully aware that she had never visited Utah or secured a hotel room costing more than $89 a night. She completely refrained from discussing the bitter revelation when her granddaughter finally returned home, choosing instead to sit at her table dwelling on her $18 sacrifice while quietly wondering if the luxurious Asher Adams Hotel boasted a beautiful view. Meanwhile, Rubio decisively closed the exact same thin folder he had carried in that morning, calmly buttoned his suit jacket, and confidently exited Rayburn Room 2359 while completely ignoring the frantic reporters shouting his name. A desperate journalist screamed a question regarding the federal financial filings, but he refused to turn around or acknowledge inquiries about his debate preparation, purposefully marching toward his commercial coach flight bound for Miami. He was eagerly journeying home to visit his resilient mother, the very woman who sacrificed decades meticulously cleaning elite hotel suites that she could never possibly afford to sleep inside. I remain ignorant of their specific conversational topics that evening, but I know he never needed to describe the opulent luxury to her, as she already knew exactly what those rooms looked like from the subservient side of the door. I exhaustedly drove home that night obsessively contemplating Gloria, Rubio's mother, and my own mother, who poured coffee and wiped down greasy diner counters for 22 years without ever once uttering the word oligarchy. She neither dramatically fought abstract wealth inequality, nor fraudulently expensed luxury travel to it. She simply labored tirelessly, returned home utterly exhausted, and cooked our dinner without a single complaint because that defined the stoic culture of my youth. The incredible people I grew up with never delivered fiery public speeches regarding the working class because they fundamentally embodied it, and absolutely nobody ever rewarded their quiet suffering with luxury hotel suites or glowing microphones disguised as political movements. Somewhere in America tonight, an exhausted woman is sitting at a dimly lit kitchen table obsessively counting the remnants of her Social Security check, bitterly wondering if the meager $18 she donated 2 years ago accomplished anything remotely positive. Somewhere else, a struggling man who parted with $25 merely because a charismatic figure on his television promised to fight for his survival deserves to witness this exact narrative unfold. If you firmly believe that politicians claiming to fiercely advocate for your interests should actually reflect your modest lifestyle, please subscribe to this channel. Share this devastating truth with any working-class donor who desperately believed a hollow promise. Finally, leave the word receipt in the comments below because financial receipts will always expose the absolute truth.